I guess I'd like to start by saying what a privilege it is to speak with you at this conference, and I do also appreciate that the topic I'm speaking about today is something I'll never fully understand. I'm a strong believer in subject-centered critique, and although I do think there are some limits to that as well, as a heterosexual man speaking about violence done to women, it's important for me to recognize my own positionality and some of the evident biases I will inevitably bring to the discussion. Most often when I start to think about violence, I often find myself returning to the thought of Walter Benjamin, and actually I was thinking about the previous presentation, I think it was very Benjaminian in terms of its fragmentary approach as well. Now what I take most from Benjamin is the proposition that the greatest challenge we face is to do ethical justice to the subject of violence. And so I do hope I bring some kind of justice to that subject today. Now I'd like to begin with this artwork on my opening slide from my brilliant wife, the artist Chantal Meza, who's actually here today and also will be speaking tomorrow. Now this artwork is from her Obscure Beasts collection, which is now part of her State of Disappearance collection that's permanently housed at the Chancellor's Building at the University of Bath. Because of their evocative and abstract style, each of Chantal's works allow for multiple interpretations. Now, what I often find myself visualizing in this work is a bloodied footprint on the ground. What does it mean to walk in those footsteps? How much pain had been endured before the blood visibly seeped onto public ground? Do we even notice it? And what happened to the body after the blood eventually vanished into the soil of the earth? Blood, as Gil Anejar has wonderfully explained, should perhaps be seen both as an element and also one of the most important political categories we know. And as our bodies continually remind, as an element, it also remains deeply gendered in terms of the politics of its flows. With this in mind, I want to explore with you in this talk today two regimes of violence, which I think are distinct but can also overlap in the bloody flow of killing women. Those regimes concern the spectacle of violence and also the violence of disappearance. Let's begin with the spectacle of violence and how it connects to what René Girard addresses in terms of the sacred. Now, in a book I wrote a few years back titled Ecce Humanitas, I tried to explain how the history of violence can be explained through the various attempts to claim ownership and control over competing sacred objects. This allows for a more critical take on the politics of sacrifice, as it is revealed to be that which must be killed in order for a sacred order to thrive. Now, whilst I appreciate the sacred might appear as a kind of theological term that relates to religious systems and orders, it is my sense that we know of no political project that doesn't uphold sacred claims or reveal the primacy of one clear sacred object for power. If the body of Christ, for example, was the sacred object for power for Christianity, for realists it was the military hero that manifests the power of the state, while for liberalism, the sacred object was consecrated through a vision of humanity complete. All of which have sanctioned and justified violence in their name, as Girard would have undoubtedly understood. Yet, despite all the attention Girard gives in his rich analysis to the politics of sacrifice, his work has remained notably biased in terms of its gendered examples. Much is said in his book Violence and the Sacred, for instance, of the examples of Cain and Abel, and even back to Oedipus. But much less consideration is given in his work to a more telling example that predates Sophocles' tale by a generation. I am referring here to the sacrifice of Iphigenia in Aeschylus' Oresteia. The killing of the innocent virgin Iphigenia at the hands of her father, Agamemnon, is one of the most brutal and horrifying in all the Greek tragedies. The Oresteia, for many, is the start text for Western literature. It begins with a feminicide. In order to appease the gods and let his ship sail into battle, King Agamemnon offers up a gift of sacrifice. This has to be a sacrifice worthy of the name. That sacrifice is found in the body of his innocent virgin daughter. While the sacred claim underwriting the violence speaks to heavenly forces, including the winds that allow Agamemnon's vessels to sail, the act of killing this innocent child reveals to us the basest of qualities. As Simon Critchley writes, the sacrifice of Iphigenia was not dutiful obedience to Artemisis, but the guilty weakness of an ambitious man, and the capture of Troy was not a just war against a foreign aggressor, but a brutal act of destruction, violence, and rape. Commenting on the exemplary nature of this killing, Nicole Lorax notes how the practice of human sacrifice has allowed for the flouting of, to quote, pious precautions and obedience to the myth to deliver young girls always to the slaughterer's knife. Hence, the sacrifice of the Virgin allows the unthinkable to be thought. And although the real city did not sacrifice its young girls, at least not in this way, the performance causes, as she says, the double satisfaction of transgressing in our imagination the taboo of phonos, murder, and of continually dreaming about virgin's blood. This taboo is particularly haunting. Iphigenia's sorrow, as I named it in Ecce Humanitas, has been reenacted continuously throughout the ages, with the innocent child becoming a victim of violence at the hands of disregarding men who claim to be performing sacrificial rites for the sake of bringing glory and favour. A sense of glory, we might add, which is bound to ideas of the greater good. We might recount you the tragic words of the young Helena Wanda Blasknawa, whose words written on the walls of cell 3 of the Gestapo headquarters in Zedepen would be taken by Heinrich Gorecki for his unrivaled symphony of sorrows. No, mother, do not weep. This raises an important conceptual point I want to think more about in terms of this kind of violence. The sacrifice of a life is always presented as a kind of gift. It is deemed necessary and can always appeal to some greater good, which can be offered up in thanks to an already established higher power. Now, the logic of sacrifice is not consigned to religion, but will be fully in keeping with the modern order of things. If the modern condition can be said to intellectually begin with the Kantian injunction to place the human at the center of its mortal universe, the aesthetic secularization of life begins with the raw realities of degradation, torture, and human suffering. An image of life reduced to its abstract nakedness. The start point for this, I argued, is Francisco de Goya's Disasters of War series, which depicted the brutalities of war in their most nakedly ambitious and unforsaken form. Goya's meticulously carved prints denounce war through their depiction of an immense aesthetic violence. He engraves the unspeakable. He forces us to face the intolerable over and over, offering a visual anthology of the worst episodes in the history of the human condition. Transcending any particular conflict, these images show our capacity to deny our fellow humans any claims to a shared humanity. Now, crucially for our concerns, Goya did not turn away from the violence forced upon and in the act of killing women. Contained within the Disasters of War series is a series of the disasters endured by women. The sexual violence in Goya's reproductions disturb the viewer as the capacity for love is mutilated by the liberation of perverted desires, which appear all too normal in a state of war. But Goya's etchings, the photographs of their times, should not be seen as static or final depictions of harrowing scenes. The reproductions are reproductive. Violated bodies produce violated offspring, and there is an enduring madness presented after the fact, just as children are born in torment, having been conceived in the most savage acts of violation. The male sexual organ is wielded as a weapon to cause infliction. Hence, once everything is reduced to such materiality, the only decision that remains is whether to reproduce or to be discarded upon the scrap heap of history. Goya's etchings thus might be interpreted as the 82 commandments of our political modernity, spanning from life's beginning to its meaningless end. What's also striking about Goya's work is how he exposes the rationale for violence. If there is a sacred claim being made, it certainly doesn't appeal to any god. Goya, in fact, paints the death of God at the hands of men. Men who put themselves in the place of God and carry out sacrifices with no need to appeal to any external authority, for the power and judgment is theirs alone, and it's enough. Violence, in other words, can be both sacrificial and yet arbitrary in the very same movement. Women can be killed simply because men can kill them. They are, in other words, simply an arbitrary and fleeting gift that man gives to itself. A gift, we might say, that can also now easily be thrown away, like any object that is gifted and equally disposable in modern times. And we see this drama devastatingly portrayed in Goya's two paintings, Bandit Stripping a Woman and Bandit Murdering a Woman. Now, in more recent times, there are a number of female artists who have fully recognized this violence of the sacred and sought to subvert its logics and inherent violences. I am especially thinking here of the Cuban artist Ana Mendieta, whose filmed sequence Sweating Blood, as pictured here on the left, spoke to the evident biblical themes, whilst also highlighting the contemporary abuse of women. I would like, however, to now use Mendieta as a bridge into the second regime of violence I identified at the beginning. The vanishing body that leaves its trace was an integral element in the work of Mendieta. While her work made evident connections to the ancestral, in order to open up critical discussions on the questions of presence and absence, might we not also use it in a more political context to account for the forced disappearance of bodies from the terrestrial plane? As she wrote in 1981, "Covered by the earth, whose prisoner am I feel death palpitating underneath." Now, some have suggested that Mendieta's work was tragically fated, and it prophesied her own violent death. It has also been noted how her work has a dimension of conscious decolonization, as it connects to indigenous ideas regarding the life-world relationship outside of the triumph of reason. But what might her work tell us about the violence of feminicide, which often occurs as a hidden spectacle that is subsequently repackaged for public consumption, while on other occasions connecting to the hidden order of violence and the denial of one's right to live in any affirmative sense? Mendieta's silhouettes stand out in this regard as a form of self-portraiture and testimony to a body that is now elsewhere, and which reveals to us an open wound in time. What remains here is precisely the image of absence, whose ghostly social presence actually makes the figurative more apparent. This brings me directly to the complex relationship between spectacle and disappearance. Disappearance, I have argued, is the most extreme form of violence. It prevents the living from living and it prevents the dead from dying. However, to have a better conceptual grasp on this, we can again turn back to Greek mythology, which still remains fertile for thinking about the logics of violence. Now, I would like to now turn to the case of Persephone as a definitive start point in understanding the abduction and the violent disappearance of women. For those of you who don't know, Persephone was the daughter of Zeus and Demeter, the goddess of harvest. She was conceived out of a violent rape, and then she was then gifted, and it's termed gifted, to Hades, the god of the underworld, with the help of Gaia, Mother Earth. A crack actually opens up in the earth and she is taken below. The grief-stricken mother walks the earth for 9 days with a flamed torch in search of her daughter. Since the grief-stricken Demeter forbids the earth to produce during this time, it is said that this resulted in famine and effectively gave rise to the very idea of the seasons. Now, there are 3 important points I want to take from this. First of all, back to the original conception of the term, rape appears as abduction. So we have a sense of rape as being a form of abduction that takes place. Secondly, in the case of Persephone, disappearance is also a gift, an absolute expression of sovereign power. But it's not just any gift. It is a gift that is overlaid with an even more formidable logic. The power to offer up a life to another without any consequence. The power, in other words, what Persephone reveals, is the power in the hands of sovereign men who can operate with impunity. And I think this is a key point, impunity. The third point, which is something I'll return to later, is the deep ecological significance of this. Now, in terms of artistic representations, it's also worth considering Rubens' interpretation. This was housed at the Torre de la Prada in Madrid, and it was destroyed by Imperial Austrian forces during Wars of Succession in a 1714 fire. There's something deeply tragic about a masterpiece artwork depicting violent abduction and disappearance, which in itself disappears. Now, as Rubens' portrait gestures, and what I take from the case of Persephone, is how it is wrong to see disappearance as some kind of anti-spectacle event, or even as a form of violence devoid of communication. The spectacle of potential absence is projected onto the bodies of the living, those who now fear for their lives, just as the message speaks in a haunting language through its victims' silent screams, which can be deafening to those who hear them. This creates a real regime of terror, which has since been violently politicized. That anybody could disappear at any given moment just for occupying the wrong body points to an ecology of violence, a true climate of fear, which is both physically real and has a life independent of its actual occurrence. The act of disappearance takes us into the realm of the unknown, a mental space of anguish, torment, and imagined possibilities. It is part of the psychic life of violence, which turns imagination into an enemy of the self. That is why disappearance is much more than simply the denial of a person's right to be on the earth. The memory of those who disappear serves as a warning to others that they may suffer a similar fate and be forgotten entirely. It is therefore not only the denial of a life, but an assault on the very idea that a meaningful life eventually finds also its dignity in death. Disappearance, then, is a form of violence against the future. It immobilizes. Through the negation of life, it openly recruits the haunting memory of ghosts in order to impose a tyranny over the will of the living. And in doing so, it resurfaces the bodies of the disappeared through the very act of denial, miscommunication, injustice, and the long drawn-out nightmare of uncertainty over whether the deceased might eventually be located and their bodies and minds laid to rest. Now, I don't want to dwell too much time on this, but I do think it's important to stress that the violence of disappearance, especially the disappearance of women, is a central motif in the entire history of imperial power. We might, of course, think here about the eternal city of Rome. Now, again, if we follow the myth, it is said that Rome was founded by two brothers, Romulus and Remus, who, according to the myth, were the daughters of Rhea, who again was violently raped by Mars, the god of war. You see there's a recurring theme happening throughout that entire mythological history. She would then be raised, the brothers would then be raised and fed by Lupa. And the myth was that she was a she-wolf. Now, there might be some truth to this myth in the sense of the idea of the she-wolf was also the ways in which prostitutes were defined at the time. And I think this is something which Jacques Derrida deals with brilliantly in the transcribed lectures on the Beast and the Sovereign, of the recurring motif of the wolf. Now, of course, there is an evident Girardian reading of the mimetic rivalry, first of all, between Romulus and Remus. But as we know, following Romulus's victory, there is the well-documented and so-called necessary rape and abduction of the Sabine women. Hence, the first known imperial power the world has ever conceived is born of an epic rape. It is also linked to the disappearance of peoples and the forced movement linked to ideas of sexual power of reproduction. Now, just one quick point I would also like to make on this, because I think it's conceptually interesting to compare. For those of you who know the myth, you will also know that Romulus himself disappears. And this is something, I won't read through the quotes, but as commented by both Plutarch and also Titus Livius. I do think there's an interesting comparison here between sovereign power, which always strives for its own invisibility to become eternal, versus the disposability of human life, which can simply disappear and vanish without a trace. One of the things which I think defines power in the contemporary digital age is precisely its invisibility, and that's why it has more of an internal quality to it. Now, back to the contemporary, I do think it's possible today to start mapping out what we might call a global topography of disappearance. What I am talking about here is disappearance as a learned practice, which first systematically mastered by the Nazis, is then exported down to Argentina, worked and adapted in the period of ideological conflict, and exported up the Americas along with its privatization. Now, when we think of the words disappearance and the disappeared, invariably our attentions turn to Latin America. It is worth, however, remembering that disappearance would become the hallmark of totalitarian regimes across the world in the post-war moment, notably favoured by military juntas in Latin America during the 1970s and 1980s, as well as in Bosnia, Cambodia, Nepal, Iraq and elsewhere. Now, perhaps not incidentally, since it took in many Nazi exiles, including Adolf Eichmann, Argentina was instructive in terms of this practice. In her harrowing book, Cruel Modernity, which deals with the history of violence in Latin America, Jean Franco forced us to recognize how systematic disappearance of women went hand in hand with an order in which the very existence of the woman had already been negated. In a chapter titled The Ghostly Arts, Franco addresses the violence inherent to disappearance, as well as strategies for possible resistance. As she says, disappearance is often doubled in denial, what she calls the disappearance of disappearance. What then remains, she explains, are mere snapshots of an existence, which in their very normality forces us to confront an ending which can only be surmised. An ending, we might say, following the ideas of Deleuze, belongs to the image of thought, but a violent image of thought. Now, for the families, the photo then became everything. because it also forced us to confront the endurance of the disappearance of disappearance, and also forced us to question more deeper questions on culpability and complicity. The silence of the demonstrating mothers, Franco writes, and the silence of the disappeared were met by the silence of the authorities, all of which converge on the silence of the photograph. Now, there are a number, I guess, of telling things that we might also focus on in the case of Argentina. First of all is the enduring memory of the Ford Falcon car, which became in itself a symbol of terror, and because this was the car used by the secret police, which was used to abduct people from the streets. We could also point to the known fact and the reason why the disappeared were understood in the first place. As the bodies washed up on the shore of the Rio Plata, the use by the state authorities of throwing bodies into the ocean. Now, this is a plane which was a few years back repatriated by Argentina, and it had the known recordings of the so-called death flights. What's really tragic about this particular plane, which was also used in the disappearance of many women, as has been proven, was that after its use, it was subsequently sold to a private company in the United States of America and used for joy flights for people to parachute out of in the Nevada desert. I'm also struck in the context of Argentina of the case of Miriam Lewin, who is pictured here inside the Virrey Kevelos concentration torture camp, which was located in the heart of Buenos Aires. Now, what I find striking about Miriam's case, of course, is that from her family, she is also Jewish, and there was a notable conscious targeting of Jewish intellectuals too by the Argentinian military junta, kind of continuing that legacy of fascism down into the southern cone. We know that every single technological advance has transformed the nature of war and violence. The digital and communications revolutions have been no different. Just as modern technology has exponentially increased our capacity to annihilate human life, so what we've also understood, and one of the apparent ironies, is that in this age of radical interconnectivity and surveillance, it's become remarkably easier to vanish human life. And I think that's a contradiction. Disappearance is easier in a digital age. Now, at the start of this, we could turn our attention to Ciudad Juarez in northern Mexico, which emerged as an explosive and dynamic borderland city following the signing of NAFTA in 1994, fully integrated into global architectures for production, political power, and economic exploitation. While the world was coming to terms with new access to the political power just created by the internet, and the very first digital revolution in the southern state of Chiapas, in direct response to NAFTA, in Juarez, stories started circulating about an alarming rise in the disappearance of young women and girls. Over time, it became clear that the city had become a site of systematic abduction, abuse, mutilation, and killing, desecrating over 1,000 women, some of which bore sacrificial scars. If disappearance is about deniability, it is the imperative that the perpetrators of violence are able to deny its witnessing and its agency. Countering disappearance, then, has required extraordinary effort on behalf of family collectives, community activists, international forensic teams, who retrace streets, scour the planetary wastelands in the hope of finding the tiniest fragments of an existence. Such efforts are revealing. Through the act of searching, what we find is that disappearance is seldom shown to be an arbitrary or random practice. It takes a monstrous organizational effort to ensure bodies are fully removed from the terrestrial surface of the earth and to ensure they are never found. Disappearance can thus be said to be about preventing the very kinds of witnessing which Primo Levi noted was the surest way to maintain some kind of humanism in the face of the most heinous violence. What also interests me, back to the case of Persephone, is how disappearance and the act of disappearance openly recruits and weaponizes ecologies in order to ensure that the bodies remain missing. And a telling example of this is Chile. During the 16 years of Pinochet's reign in Chile from the early 1970s, 1,100 people were officially registered as forcibly disappeared. Only 104 bodies have ever been found, although for local communities, the figure of the disappeared is much higher than the 1,000 or so official registered. Some were abducted due to political associations and beliefs, others for sexual abuse, some just simply randomly selected in order just to send out a political message. Now, I'm particularly taken by the story of the women of Calama in the Atacama Desert, who are still scouring for remnants of their husbands. A powerful testimony on the woman has been provided by the Chilean film director Patricio Guzman in his documentary Nostalgia for the Light, which brings us back to the emptiness of the Atacama Plains. What begins as an astronomical mediation on telescopes searching distant galaxies and stars, this particular region of Chile is home to some of the most powerful telescopes in the world, slowly turns its lens onto the uninhabitable desert and the disappearance of distant figures. Decades of searching means that the women can easily tell the difference between white stones and human fragments. Theirs is a story of defiance, where rains have refused to fall for more than a millennium. As one woman tells, "I wish telescopes didn't just look at the sky, but could go through the earth and able to locate the bodies." The women of Calama, as with the mothers of Argentina, reveals something important to recognize here. While we might in this case be discussing the disappearance of men and women, often it is the mothers who carry the labor of searching and suffer most this emotional trauma. This was devastatingly captured by Isabel Allende in a piece called Flowers in the Desert, and she says, "Where are the disappeared? Their spectres haunt the thin air of dawn. Their voices whisper in unmarked graves. Year, year, they call their wives, their mothers, their sisters, their daughters. A mob of ghosts roam the tortured American continent in search of an identity. Who invented that horrible euphemism for the disappeared? We bury the dead, we mourn them, we learn to live with them in sweet harmony, because in face of the unquestionable purpose of death, we can do nothing. But what when one of our own disappears? An immense void opens up in the soul, and in life, everything is suspended, postponed while we search." The women of Calama are poor of irredeemable poverty. They are patients of absolute patience. They are strong and they are alone. For years, no one has heard their cries. For years, justice has ignored their anguish. Their skin is tanned by leadened sun. Their eyes faded from peeking into the sand and stones, their hearts always in tears. Nothing can overcome them, not time, not the indifference of the world, not the hope broken 1,000 times and patched up again. Now, when thinking about the weaponization of ecologies, of course, we think about deserts as being particularly hostile environments, which we might say are very easily weaponized. And I'm also struck, if we then go back to Ciudad Juarez, how the mothers would often speak about their daughters as being swallowed by the desert. That became a kind of a metaphor for how they understood the desert lands. It is, however, worth also remembering that while deserts are notably hostile terrains that can be easily weaponized, for the most part, disappeared women are taken from the streets of towns and also cities, which are also, we might say, different kinds of ecologies. In these urban settings, arguably the most masterful cinematic response, or at least certainly better than Emilia Perez, appears in the Mexican filmmaker Alejandro Iñárritu's Bardo, a false chronicle of a handful of truths, which was released in 2022. Following the story of the key protagonist, Silverio Gama, who is a journalist journeying around the surreal history that defines Mexico's past and present, in one scene he appears walking in the downtown area of Mexico City, with his attention caught by the alien presence of a large desert tarantula on a quinceanera dress, which is associated with a 15-year-old girl's rite of passage, that appears in a store window on a busy street. He feels a premonition of a dark past that is soon to return. About to purchase a taco, Silverio turns and sees a woman lying on the ground in front of a church, with people walking past, oblivious to her existence. As Silverio tries to engage in a conversation with the angry woman, two men appear standing over her, and one explains to him, "Leave her. They do this all the time. They go missing, yet they keep pestering everyone. They neither return nor die. They stay by not staying." As the unknown woman then responds to Silverio's question about why she is lying there by adding, "It's better you know that you do not know," bodies all around start falling to the street in a performance that is both balletic and unsettling. Soon the protagonist is stood in a street full of unknown collapsed bodies until the sun sets in a time sequence move that returns the city fully back to nature's enveloping. All of this is watched over by a military general who observes a violence that is ultimately orchestrated by him. Iñárritu has explained this scene as a direct commentary on the nation's 130,000 disappeared who have since 2006 been an outcome of the acceleration of the war on drugs. The director also subtly shows how it is inseparable from ecology as the spiders and the sun's collapse on Mexico's urban landscape, creating one dark, silencing shadow. Now, as I briefly mentioned, despite the horrifying dangers of Mexico's political economy of violence, we do monitor many courageous attempts by communities who continue to demand answers to what happened to their disappeared. In Mexico alone, there are some 130 search collectives led by mothers and others tasked with trying to recover the remains of their missing. According to Ceci Flores, the leader of the Searching Mothers of Sonora, we have the idea that we know where they pick up our daughters, but we do not know where they are going to leave them. So if we have to tour the entire Mexican Republic, we are going to do it. For these mothers, modern Demeters, what they offer is a labour of care, which in the act of searching refuses to accept the absence. But this work is laborious and financially burdening, not to mention emotionally exhausting. The collectives depend on tip-offs, though often they simply search abandoned places, disused wells, jungled forests and open fields. There are certain clues they look for, including the traces of lime that is frequently used to cover bodies and accelerate decomposition. Their tools are rudimentary. They often rely on the insertion of a thin metal pole, as featured here, called a varilla, into the ground to release the potential stench of death. Many testimonies from these searching collectives speak of how decomposition of a person gives off its own unique odour. Now, I mentioned also the title of Isabel Allende's piece called Flowers in the Desert. What the mothers have also learned to identify is unique flower patterns growing in the soil, which also reveals places where the disappeared are buried. What toll must all this take? Aside from the fact that those searching for the disappeared often end up being violently threatened and even disappearing themselves, the psychological impact demands a more expansive appreciation of the suffering they endure. Researchers repeatedly found that living with disappearance can be truly unbearable, for the violence it passes on to others offers no kind of resolution and no prospect for recovery. The memory of loss places a perverse kind of guilt onto the shoulders of family members. Psychological studies of families dealing with missing persons have spoken of a vortex of grief, dealing with what the International Red Cross identifies to be ambiguous loss, demands new therapeutic responses that appreciate the lasting effects of this absence. Close relatives are often deeply traumatized by what they call intrusive memories. Now, as I argued in an essay I recently wrote called Primal Fear, the Weaponization of Nothingness, which was part of an edited volume, a special edition of the journal The Philosopher, which was published end of last year, which is focused on violence, but has a special series of essays on disappearance. There is, I believe, a deeper reason why disappearance is so effective as a political and psychological strategy. Psychologically, it plays into the most primal of human fears, to vanish without a trace. It weaponizes that secular fear of nothing. Disappearance takes us into the realm of the unknowable. It blinds all judgment by exposing us to the scattered dust of history. It belongs to the unintelligible. Striking with a blood-thirsty pursuit against a life, it eviscerates what might be presented as meaningful. With this in mind, we could be forgiven for seeing disappearance as rendering the aesthetic altogether meaningless. What can possibly be said when here and now is replaced by now, nowhere and never? It certainly takes us beyond the limits of philosophical and aesthetic understanding. How can we do visual justice to the memory of that which is absent? Now, in terms of offering some kind of response, I am reminded here of this quote, and I think it's an important quote by Jacques Rancière, when he says, "The purpose of art is to render visible that which is invisible." Disappearance concerns memory. It concerns the past. It concerns the future. It concerns bodies. It concerns absence. It concerns wounds in time. And it concerns the terror of the void. It, moreover, gives us a perspective into an unimaginable suffering by presenting historical violence as being all too real, but there's nothing we can do about it. Again, the nothing, I think, is crucial. Art short-circuits this aspiration by demanding a more considered and intimate reflection. Now, as I said, since 2017, both myself and Chantal Mezard have been working on a project which we have titled Disappearance, and the main aim of that has been bring together her art along with academics and policymakers to inspire a different kind of conversation. And these are photographs from an exhibition both in Bristol and then from the permanent now exhibition in the University of Bath. Now, Chantal Mezard's State of Disappearance series, I think, asks us to consider, and what I've taken most from them, the thresholds between life and death, appearance and absence, time and space, bodies and their place in the world. From images of ecologies of violence in her Fragments of a Catastrophe to ghostly apparitions in the Apparitions series, these works crucially question what disappearance means. It also shows that the state of disappearance is a state of mind, a realm that only makes sense if one interrogates in the most searching ways the psychosis of violence. The challenge presented here is no doubt formidable. What, after all, is left to paint when the body is absent? How can we possibly portray something of the human when its very presence is being denied? I think Chantal's work deals with the brutal repetitions of history, and I'm reminded of the word repetition again came up in the previous talk as well, the brutal repetitions of history, where victims become tyrants and where the persistence of annihilation results in perverse outcomes. I would like to now conclude with an anecdote of sorts. Chantal and I welcomed the new year in the city of Veracruz in Mexico. There couldn't have been a more poignant place to be in that moment, as it concentrates more than any other the complexities of time and place, history and the present. For those of you who don't know, It was in Veracruz where Hernan Cortes and the conquistadors first arrived on the shores of Latin America in 1519. Now, whilst some have debated whether this moment and not Columbus's discovery of the Americas in 1492 starts the birth of globalization and the colonial enterprise, to my estimation, colonization properly begins a few years later, which is marked this year by its 500th anniversary. Some 25 kilometers outside of the port city lies the quiet and tranquil town of Antigua. It is here in 1525 where the very first Spanish city was founded. It's also where Hernan Cortes built his first home and where the conquest of the entire continent was properly planned. Constructed by indigenous peoples, Casa de Cortes is accepted by historians and anthropologists to be the very first building ordered for construction by the Spanish in the so-called New World. The town also features La Ermita, which constructed in the same year was the first church built on the American continent. Now there is an important point to be made here, I think. Colonization shouldn't be defined as the encounter between different peoples. It is defined by settlement and the desire to establish a permanent foothold, which included the decimation of the old world and the conversion to the new. Antigua would soon be home to some 200 Spanish colonists and 600 African slaves, who were amongst the first to be abducted from places such as Cape Verde, Guinea and later Angola, and brought to the Americas for their exploitation. This created a complex, multi-layered system of domination as the European, indigenous, Latin American and African worlds collided. Antigua was also a place marked by rape, forced marriage, and the persecution of indigenous and black women. We should remember all this happened close to a century before the first settlers arrived in Jamestown in the United States, the country which now tends to dominate discussions on the history of slavery. It's perhaps also worth noting when Cortes first arrived in Veracruz, he brought with him a single slave that he bought in Cuba, which is symbolically revealing of his intentions. It's also in the Gulf Coast where Cortes took a young indigenous girl by the name of La Manincha, who was one of 20 enslaved women, subjected again to forced rape, marriage, and she would since become the scapegoat for the nation. What followed changed everything, from the start of the global project of colonization to the decimation of indigenous populations, the resultant importation of African slaves due to forced labor shortages, on to the continued exploitation and abuse of women. Now, these are some photographs that I took of Cortes's home in Antigua. What's striking is how nature has reclaimed the building and is slowly devouring its symbolic resonance from within. The trees grown over and within the facade were of deep spiritual meaning for the indigenous Totonac people, whose labour was used to build it. Stood amongst these ruins, it's hard not to feel a peculiar kind of poetic justice, as ecology returns as a reclaiming force to slowly take back what was taken. Back in the port area of the city, as we stood beneath the spectacular fireworks on New Year's Eve, the festive explosions were an audible reminder of the violence that has plagued the city and the wider state. Veracruz today is full of tensions and contradictions. It's both welcoming and hostile, with the port being the third most important in Mexico and the most important in terms of exports to the European market. It's a key battleground in the ongoing violence between Mexico's most notorious cartels, including factions of Los Zetas, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, the Gulf Cartel, and presence of members from the more media infamous group, the Sinaloa Cartel. The war is about controlling the lucrative export trade in illicit narcotics, along with controlling illegal migration flows which go up through the Veracruz region, and also controlling forced prostitution of women and children. Now, this is a photograph of a spectacle of violence, of 35 tortured bodies that were dumped on a main highway in Veracruz back in 2011, 12 of which were women. Disappeared activist Lucy Diaz, who is the coordinator of the Solcito Collective of searching mothers in Veracruz, has referred to the state as one giant clandestine grave. The scale of the problem was horrifyingly emphasized with findings of the largest clandestine graves in all of Latin America, such as the ones containing 615 bodies in Colinas de Santa Fe and El Albarillo, which were discovered near the port area between 2016 and 2022. A large percentage of the bodies excavated again were women. One of the images here actually shows the shoe of a woman. As Diaz, however, has constantly insisted, what's revealing about the disappearance in Veracruz has been the direct involvement of state officials, the police and military forces. Back in 2017, Jorge Winkler Ortiz, the state's Attorney General at the time, commented also, "Veracruz is a huge mass grave. When all the mass graves in the state are finished being open, it will be the largest mass grave in Mexico, probably the largest mass grave in the world." He has since been charged with complicity in torture, kidnapping and disappearances for working on behalf of organised crime. Upon our return to the state of Puebla, we passed the beautiful city of San Pedro Cholula. Backdropped by the magnificent snow-capped volcano, the skyline is dominated by the presence of the yellow Our Lady of Remedies Church atop of a large and lush overgrown hill. What that hill actually conceals is the world's largest pyramid, which was built by the previous Toltec Chimic peoples. Only 50 years after Cortes' army massacred 6,000 local indigenous peoples, including all the women and children, as he was en route to Mexico, the church was built directly upon the former symbol of indigenous power. Now, I talked about the complex overlaps between spectacle of violence and disappearance. I think what this shows actually is a visible case of the spectacle of disappearance. The old literally buried on the new so it could become more visible and prominent. The church would, of course, be continually instructive in creating systems of patriarchal domination which still persist today. To end, when exploring the logics of colonization, Michel Foucault put forward the idea of the colonial boomerang to argue that what was tested out overseas in terms of systems of rule and violence would eventually find its way home. I'm struck here by the comment which Hannah Arendt made when she said that the greatest crime that Hitler committed was to turn Europe itself into a colony. And we might recall, thinking about the gendered dimensions to that violence, the words of Heinrich Himmler from a speech he delivered in Posen on October the 4th, 1943, as he sought to justify the final solution. To quote, "We faced the question, what should we do with the women and the children? I decided here to find a completely clear solution. I did not regard myself as justified in exterminating the men. That is to say, it was easy to have them killed, and to allow the avengers in the shape of children come to our sons and grandchildren. A difficult decision had to be taken. These people had to disappear from the earth." One of the most astute commentators on the Holocaust, Zygmunt Bauman, argued that in the face of such disappearance, we have a duty to remember. We have deluded ourselves if we believe the disappeared are a category that belong to history. As we look across the world today, we see disappearance fault lines, as I've called them in a new forthcoming book, appearing everywhere. From Syria, as the stories on the main news of the BBC yesterday pointed out, of the missing children, to the Sonora Desert, throughout Latin America, and of course into Gaza, and then into the planetary waters. And if at the edge of these fault lines we can still see the falling bodies of 1,000 murdered Iphigenias, within the depths 1,000 more Persephones are being killed with impunity. History is only important if it allows us to make sense of the present. How we therefore remember those women who have been sacrificed and those who are condemned to be another statistic adding to the disappeared of history is not just a historical duty. It will have a profound bearing on any future claim we might have to something we might dare to call a shared humanity. Thank you for listening.